Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here tonight. We're celebrating the year-long celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation tonight, and I will introduce Jim Basker with his wonderful collection of writings, Antislavery Writings, in a moment. But I do want to mention some upcoming programs. Tomorrow night, we have at the Plaza Library, in association with the Truman Library, our ongoing partner, the Presidential Library, the second in our series on the presidency. We've been doing Hail to the Chiefs. This would be the chiefs who win things, elections and whatnot, the presidents, not those other chiefs. And sorry, I know, it's ugly, it's true. But we've been doing the Hail to the Chiefs about the presidents. C-SPAN has been covering a lot of them, as you know. It's been a great series. And we started a second series called Beyond the Gowns, which is about the First Ladies. And we had our first about Michelle Obama a couple of weeks ago with a wonderful crowd at the Plaza Library. And the second is tomorrow night at the Plaza Library. Henry Adams, who has spent a lot of time in Kansas City, is the American curator at the Nelson Museum and the interim curator, the interim director at the Kemper Museum. Henry is a direct descendant of our second First Lady. Abigail Adams, the great-great-great-grandson of Abigail Adams, and he will be talking about her tomorrow night at the Plaza Library, and Henry is always amusing and frequently accurate. Sorry. In addition to that, I do want to mention a couple of other things that are coming up. On Thursday night, here at the Central Library, we'll have part of an ongoing series with the Citizens Association. Citizens Association, which in the 50s and 60s was central to Kansas City's politics and to making Kansas City's politics about good government, about good public policy, went into decline. It might be said about the same time the city stopped having good public policy. And we're trying to revive it. A lot of people are trying to revive it, Dan Coffrin notably the head of it. And we're doing the second in a series of events with them, a panel in this case on the police department on local control. Now we planned this panel before the mayor appointed, which he did last week, his commission on local control. So this is a very hot issue. Kansas City is the only city in the United States which does not have local control of the police department. There may be some reasons for that. We could name the first reason, which is Jim and Tom Pendergast, but there are other reasons as well. And you'll hear a good debate on Thursday night about whether or not we should keep the governor in charge of our police commission or return it to local control. And we've got many other things upcoming, ongoing series on the Civil War with the folks in the History Department at Fort Leavenworth. This month we have a program on Vicksburg, Grant's masterpiece, and the other great battle in July of 1863. And maybe, who knows, maybe Greg Hospodor will convince you the most important battle in July of 1863. And then Wednesday, April 17th, I want to mention return of a historian who's been here before, who's quite a wonderful speaker, and who talks about founding finance, how debt, speculation, foreclosures, protests, and crackdowns made us a nation. How familiar all those words sound, and yet they were important words in the 1770s, 80s, and 90s as well. William Hoagland will be here on Wednesday, April 17th. And last but not least, I'll just mention towards the end of the month, April 22nd, this will be a sellout, so get your tickets early. I'll be having a conversation with Jim Lehrer of the NewsHour here at the Central Library. And Jim, as many of you know, probably is, relatively speaking, a local boy who's made good, and we'll be talking about that, about his career and about presidential debates, in which he's played a role. So history is our middle name at the public library. If you're not on our mailing list, please get on our mailing list. You can do that online, or there's a form outside you can pick up and get on our mailing list. It's a privilege tonight to introduce James Basker, Jim Basker, who is the president of the Gilder-Lehrman Institute. The Gilder-Lehrman Institute, founded by one friend of mine, Dick Gilder. I sat on the Monticello board with him, and his close friend, Lou Lehrman, who has written a wonderful book on Abraham Lincoln himself, on the Peoria speech after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. These are two men who've made a lot of money in the world of business and have devoted a lot of their lives to putting that money to use to build consciousness, particularly in schools, particularly with teachers, of the importance of history, and particularly American history. And Jim Basker has been the leader, has been their point person in doing this. They conduct seminars and institutes for teachers, give out awards for history, including a couple of the most important awards, such as the Frederick Douglass Award, with a major dinner in New York every year. And they've become, I think, absolutely central to the teaching of history in high schools and generally to the common reader. They've reformed, reestablished, refurbished the New York Historical Society, and with Jim Basker's leadership, they've put together some of the best traveling exhibits in the United States, some major exhibits around slavery, around Alexander Hamilton, which Jim Basker did, and then smaller exhibits which travel to such places as the Kansas City Public Library. We've had 5 or 6 of their exhibits, most recently a George Washington exhibit, and more to come. So they are very, very important to the presentation of history in our country. Jim Basker himself, besides curating the Alexander Hamilton exhibit, which I think has gotten among the best reviews as their slavery exhibit of any history exhibit in history, has written a book on Alexander Hamilton. He's written the book Lincoln in His Own Words, An Intimate View of Our Greatest President, and a book on John Brown. He's a member of the Society of American Historians, Mount Vernon Scholarly Advisory Board, and he spent 7 dark years at Harvard University. He's a visiting professor at NYU, Cambridge, and perhaps representing his attitude towards history, he also taught at the Rogue Community College in Oregon. I like that. And his publications include Amazing Grace, poems about slavery. He has published, as you're perhaps aware, the reason for his being here, the latest in the Library of America, which is essentially the collection of the important American writings, the Library of America, American Antislavery Writings, and these are wonderful, wonderful writings from Samuel Sewall, who we were talking about outside, who is one of the most eloquent figures in American history, underappreciated, as Jim Basker and I agree. The judge in the Salem witch trials, who recanted his position in the Salem witch trials, and who also wrote one of the first anti-slavery tracts, saying that slavery rends asunder what God has joined together, men from their country, husbands from their wives, parents from their children. Nothing more eloquent than that, except there are eloquent things throughout this book. The first line of the defense of the presentation of John Quincy Adams, former President of the United States, and great-grandfather of Henry Adams will be here tomorrow night, of the African slaves who were temporarily freed from the Amistad, and in their defense, the first line of his defense rings out too. Is it possible that a president of the United States should be ignorant that the right of personal liberty is individual? There are things like this throughout this book. It is a very moving book, and we're honored to have Jim Basker, the president of the Gilder-Lehrman Institute and the editor of the American Anti-Slavery Writings, with us tonight. Jim.
Crosby, thank you for that unbelievably warm introduction. And I want to thank also so many people here at the library who have been so gracious and hospitable in welcoming me on my first visit to Kansas City. But I trust it will not be my last. And I'm very grateful especially to Henry Fortunato and to Lorenzo Butler here in the staff and everyone who's welcomed me. I hope also before I begin that everyone has a copy of this collector's item from their seat. You can treat this, if you will, as a kind of bingo card and try to keep track of the text, because I'm going to be talking about this book tonight, mentioning a lot of texts and authors, and most of the individual texts that I'm going to mention are listed here. So in case you want to make note or just follow the plot, that is at hand for you. I'm not going to lecture to you tonight. I really want to talk about the book and give you a sense of where it comes from, and then take you through some of the most surprising and perhaps significant elements. To give you an idea of this volume overall, which is in this wonderful fine paper that Library of America uses, more than 900 pages compressed here, there are 216 different texts in this collection by more than 155 different writers. It took me 8 years to research and compile and prepare this volume. It has quite an inclusive scope. Every genre of literature you can imagine is included. Poems, novels, short stories, slave narratives, plays, speeches, sermons, even children's books, and I'll show you an example of that in due course. There are, of course, male and female writers. There are black and white writers. There are writers from North and South. The material is arranged chronologically from 1688, a point that I'll return to in a minute, all the way down to 1865, with the culmination in the passage of the 13th Amendment. And I think the texts together constitute a very important tradition within American literature. The texts also tell an important story when you line them up and begin to read them, as Crosby has very dutifully, one after another. I think it's one of the most important stories that we have in American history, and I'm pleased to present it tonight. There are a couple of themes that occur to me at the outset that govern all this material. One is simply the obvious importance of memory and the dangers of losing it. Much of the material here, certainly more than half of it, maybe as much as 80%, has been out of print for 100 years or so, at least. And it's in danger, really, of being lost, even in this era of Google Books, maybe perhaps more lost than ever out in the ether. And it's very important that we try to bring these materials back into circulation. It's one of my missions to see this material in schools and being used by teachers with students. And the other theme at the outset is the power of literature, which I think is demonstrated very dramatically in this collection of material. We tend to think about politicians making history and legislators shaping history. But this material shows the force of literature over time to change sensibilities, to change worldview, and eventually to precipitate action in society. I want to speak to that point about the power of literature a little further for just a moment. We're all familiar with Abraham Lincoln's purported comment when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe in the White House. So you're the little woman whose book caused this great war. We don't know for sure that he said that, but obviously it's emblematic of how forceful people at the time thought that Uncle Tom's Cabin had been and the literature it represents. But in fact, one of the things I talk about in the introduction to this volume are all of the perverse tributes that were paid to the power of literature by the defenders of slavery. If we think about the censorship that was enacted in slave states against slave narratives, against so-called incendiary literature, against anything written by abolitionists, there's an incredible story, but a true one. In Maryland in the 1850s, a black minister, a free black man who ran a Methodist congregation, was sentenced to prison in Maryland in 1856 for possessing a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. and he wasn't freed from prison until the midway through the Civil War. Or we take a story like David Walker, some say the forefather of black nationalism, an outspoken, angry man, hugely articulate spokesperson who wrote an appeal to the colored citizens of America in 1829 and contrived very cleverly to circulate it even in the South through black churches and black social groups. Well, Walker suffered the fate of many such writers. His book was banned in virtually every southern state, and a bounty was put on his head by the state of Georgia, $10,000 alive or $1,000 dead. And there were other episodes that we could go into. Elijah Lovejoy, a printer, an abolitionist printer in Illinois, whose shop was not only ransacked and press destroyed, but he was effectively lynched. We come all the way down to the episode famously in the U.S. Senate, where Charles Sumner, having provoked with his speech about the crime against Kansas, Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, Brooks resorted to violence, came into the Senate floor and caned Sumner unconscious. It was 3 years before Sumner could resume his seat. So the question I want to ask around all of these episodes of violence and censorship, turn the question around. Why were there no laws passed in the North against pro-slavery literature? And why was there not violence against pro-slavery writers and speakers? I think the answer is that the defenders of slavery felt the force of these ideas. They felt that they were ultimately in a losing battle. And I think often the resort to violence tells us that there's a sense almost, not quite of desperation, but of need to resort to other means. And I don't think people in the North felt there was anything to fear, particularly from pro-slavery ideas. But I want to turn the framework around in another way with another example from the introduction. And it involves a second question about the reaction of a Union soldier. This is a Union soldier from Illinois, Lieutenant Jones, who was stationed in Tennessee in 1862. And in October 2nd, 1862, Lieutenant Jones heard about the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He's out in the field with his troops, and the preliminary emancipation came down to him. And here is what he wrote in a letter that survives and is actually housed in the Gilder-Lehrman collection in New York City at the Historical Society. He said in a letter to his wife, "The year of Jubilee has indeed come to the poor slave. The proclamation is a death blow to slavery. It is what I have expected and what I have hoped for. We now know what we are fighting for. We have an object, and that object is avowed. Oh, what a day for rejoicing will it be when America, the boasted land of the free and home of the brave, shall have erased from its fair escutcheon the black stain of human slavery." He went on in the same letter to say that he believed the majority of the people and of the soldiers will sustain the president in his act. Well, my question is, obviously, it wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation itself that moved Lieutenant Jones to say these things, but what had prepared him and so many of his soldiers, and as he thinks other Americans, to welcome the Emancipation Proclamation as a kind of deliverance in 1862? This is the question that this book sets out to answer in tracing anti-slavery writing from 1688 to 1865, culminating in the 13th Amendment. So let me say something about a few of the most surprising and, in my view, significant features of this literature. Crosby touched on one of them just a moment ago. The first thing that struck me in researching and compiling this material was how early some of these voices spoke out against slavery. 1688 in Pennsylvania, a group of Mennonites drafted a petition and circulated it in the Quaker communities to several meetings at different levels, calling for an end to slavery. And in 1693, another man of religion, George Keith, was active in Pennsylvania and in New York, where he published his pamphlet against slavery. Samuel Sewall, up in Massachusetts, one of my favorite figures from 17th and 18th century life, an extraordinary man, a judge, as you heard, at the Salem witch trials, who uniquely among those judges, 5 years later, recanted his role and said we were wrong, effectively. A man of deep conscience, who in 1700 began recording in his diary that he had deep qualms about the slave trade, about transporting Africans to the New World, and published that year what was the first abolitionist piece in Massachusetts, which would be the state probably most radically and centrally involved. Another of the features that struck me at every juncture was how absolute and uncompromising, how radical and strident some of these early writers were. This wasn't a gradual arrival at a conviction about slavery being wrong. I think of figures like Anthony Benezet, the great Quaker in Philadelphia, who began in 1759 writing tracts against slavery that were reprinted in England and that became some of the most forceful writings in the birth of the British anti-slavery movement. Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce went to school to Anthony Benezet and his writings, or John Woolman, another very, very powerful Quaker. But the one I want to read to you for a second is a fellow called Benjamin Lay, another Quaker who was in Philadelphia in the 1730s. He'd come up from Barbados, where he had experience of slavery firsthand there, but I think he was particularly shocked to find it in a colony like Pennsylvania. He wrote a pamphlet in 1737 called All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage. And here's the tone I want you to hear of how he speaks to his fellow Christians about slavery. He says of these Christian, so-called Christian slaveholders, I say, you are got beyond gospel, law, Abraham, prophets, patriarchs, to Cain the murderer, and beyond him too, to the devil himself. Beyond Cain, for he murdered but one that we know of, but you have many thousands, or caused him to be so. And for aught I know, many hundreds of thousands within 50 years. What do you think of these things, you brave gospel ministers that keep poor slaves to work for you to maintain you and yours in pride and so much idleness or laziness and fullness of bread, the sins of Sodom? How do these things become your plain dress, demure appearance, feigned humility, all but hypocrisy, which according to truth's testimony must have the hottest place in hell? He wasn't a gradualist. And it's very striking to hear these early voices so adamant in their deep conviction. Another of the things that struck me as this book came together were the number of women writers. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, we're dealing with a world where we're not used to thinking of women as prominent in the public sphere, although gradually assuming careers as writers. But among some of the early anti-slavery writers were people like Jane Dunlap, a servant girl in Boston. We don't know very much about her at all, but she began writing poems in 1771, inspired by Phyllis Wheatley, to whom the wonderful black slave servant who became a kind of prodigy of the poetic world and actually published a volume of her work in London. But Jane Dunlap was inspired by her, wrote poems of tribute to her, and welcomed blacks as equals into the Christian church. And others, so many women and writers I could give you examples of the 40 in this volume. Lucretia Mott, passionate anti-slavery activist in the 1830s and 40s, who wrote a sermon to medical students. She was invited to deliver a sermon to the medical school in Philadelphia. And she chose to talk to these doctors about how any person, all of them men, of course, at that time, but any man who was a professional healer, perforce had to be, in conscience, anti-slavery. It's a remarkable statement from her. And there are so many others, but one of my favorites is a pair of writers, sisters, called Hannah and Mary Townsend, who in 1847, and I want to read from their work briefly, actually put together an alphabet aimed at children just learning to read. And this is their alphabet. I'll show you just what it looks like on the page, a big letter of the alphabet with a short poem under each letter, each of them designed to inculcate anti-slavery views and that moral sensibility in children as they learn to read. Here are what A, B, and C sound like. A is an abolitionist, a man who wants to free the wretched slave and give to all an equal liberty. B is a brother with a skin of somewhat darker hue, but in our Heavenly Father's sight, he is as dear as you. C is the cotton field to which this injured brother's driven, when, as the white man's slave, he toils from early morn till even, and so on. a book that circulated throughout the 1840s and 50s. Two others that are my favorite women writers, and they turn up, each of them in surprising ways, I think. We forget sometimes the Battle Hymn of the Republic was actually written by Julia Ward Howe, a prominent New Yorker who had overheard soldiers, Union soldiers in late 1861, marching to the tune of a marching song, John Brown, appropriate name here in Kansas, I think. But she created new lyrics that turned the Union Army's campaign into a campaign to end slavery, as you remember. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. That's in February 1862, virtually the beginning of the Civil War. And another woman writer who turned up in a slightly surprising context was Louisa May Alcott, who we all think of as the writer of Little Women and stories for adolescent girls, and my two daughters have both read her works. She wrote several short stories against slavery, and one of them I've included in the anthology called An Hour. And it's a remarkable story which would stand even regardless of its subject matter. It's poised at midnight at the deathbed of a plantation owner, round whom are gathered his family. One of the servants and his son has come back from the north to be there. And the slave girl who is the servant is actually falling in love across the room with the son from up north. There's a kind of sparkle of romance. But it's midnight, the old man is dying, and meanwhile, outside the house, a slave rebellion is brewing. And the slave girl is the only one in the room who knows. I'm not going to tell you how the story ends, but there's love and murderous tension all around that scene. It's an amazing piece, and I'm startled that anthologists have rarely ever surfaced it that I know of. I recommend it all to you. What we remember also from these women writers is that, of course, the anti-slavery movement brought women into the public sphere as writers and advocates and organizers and campaigners and organizers of boycotts and of fundraising campaigns, and they very swiftly transferred those skills and values into the women's rights movement, which emerged also in the 1840s as a parallel, sometimes complementary and sometimes competing political cause in the 19th century. So there's a deep history that's embedded in all of the writings by women. I was surprised also at the number of black writers who turned up, and so many of them, each of them with an amazing story. And each of the texts in this volume has such a story. I mentioned Phyllis Wheatley, this child prodigy who came as a little girl to Boston in the middle of the 18th century. She was 7 or 8 years old, parentless, purchased as a slave off a slave ship on a dock in Boston. I mean, it's just remarkable to think of this child surviving the passage, all that it endured, the language and cultural adjustment. She was taken into a household as a servant of a man called John Wheatley to be a companion to his daughter. And Phyllis proved to be a genius. As the tutors who were teaching Wheatley's daughter, Phyllis was learning. And she was learning history and English and then Latin. And by the age of 13, Phyllis Wheatley was publishing poems in magazines and newspapers all over New England. And by 18, had a volume of poetry coming out. She went on a literary tour of England when she published her book. Many people don't remember she became the first black writer in America to pay a public tribute to George Washington, a fantastic poem that she wrote when he became commander-in-chief in 1775. And Washington wrote a letter that survives praising her poem and inviting her to come visit him. And many of us believe that she did. I also believe that from that moment in Washington's life, his attitude towards slavery and black people began to change in dramatic ways. But anyway, Phyllis Wheatley is a presence. Jupiter Hammond, another figure of the 18th century, less familiar to us today, a man who never escaped slavery. Jupiter Hammond was born in about 1711, lived to 1800. He never was a free man. But in about 1759, he began publishing very pious Christian poems. But one of them that came along, and I'll just give you a few lines from it, was a subtle act of resistance. He cast it as a dialogue between the kind master and the dutiful servant. Now imagine this written by a slave, and he's putting lines in the mouths alternately of a master and a servant, And the master constantly is basically saying, well, good servant, you'll be loyal to me. No matter what, you'll follow me. And the servant is subtly deflecting him and saying things like, dear master, that's my whole delight, thy pleasure for to do, as far as grace and truth's in sight. Thus far I'll surely go. And he continues to remind the master that there's a higher master they both serve, and that only as far as Christian ethics will allow will the servant follow the master. It's a remarkably subtle act of, I think, of Christian defiance and resistance. Others are more fiery writers. David Walker in the 1820s, who really upset the country with his appeal addressed to the colored citizens of America. We all know about Frederick Douglass's writings and his speeches, which are so powerful. But here in this anthology, I've included the only piece of fiction Frederick Douglass ever wrote, called The Heroic Slave, 1853. It's my theory that he wrote it as fiction. It's based on the real event when the Creole, slave ship, was taken in a slave rebellion in the 1840s and actually went down to British islands in the Caribbean where the slaves were freed. It's my theory he wrote this story as fiction because if he'd endorsed it publicly, he would have been supporting a slave insurrection and he could have been arrested and prosecuted for that act. But there it is, his only fiction. And there are scores of slave narratives, each of them telling incredible stories, almost incredible. But one of them that is among the most extraordinary is Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave, published in 1853. The reason it's so extraordinary is because Solomon Northup was not born a slave. In fact, he didn't become a slave until he was in his 30s. He was born in upstate New York. He was a free man. He was a registered voter, and he had a wife and children, and he worked in New York. Well, in pursuit of a job, he was lured to Washington, D.C., where he was kidnapped, taken south, and sold to a remote Louisiana plantation owner, where he was forced to work as a field hand for 12 years. And he could not get word out where he was. He was beyond prisoner of war in that sense. His family up north thought he'd died, disappeared, had no idea, given up hope. And finally, after 12 years, he managed to persuade someone locally to sneak a message out, and he was freed. So his narrative is a truly extraordinary account of the violations of fundamental human rights and civic rights that slavery and the fugitive slave law entailed. But of all the slave narratives included in excerpts here, for me, and this may seem a little unusual, but for me, one of the most powerful is one of the quietest. It's by a woman called Lydia Adams, and the story behind it is that she was one of the hundreds or thousands of slaves who escaped and went on to Canada, because only on British territory were they free from the powers of the Fugitive Slave Act to recapture them and take them south again in the 1850s. So there was a man called Benjamin Drew in 1855 who went up to Canada and did a kind of ethnography project, an oral history, if you will, at that time. He interviewed every former slave he could find and wrote down their account so that their stories would be recorded and told. It's a fantastic book he published in 1856 called The Refugee. 116 separate slaves' oral histories recorded there. And here is what Lydia Adams sounds like, an elderly woman by the time she's interviewed in 1855. Here's her whole account. I am 70 or 80 years old. I was from Fairfax County, Old Virginia. You listen to that, 70 or 80. You know, this tragic fact that so many slaves weren't allowed to know the year or date of their birth. She's not sure by a factor of 10 years. I was married and had 3 children when I left there for Wood County, where I lived 20 years, thence to Missouri, removing with my master's family. One by one, they sent 4 of my children away from me and sent them to the south, and 4 of my grandchildren, all to the south but 1. My oldest son, Daniel, then Sarah, all gone. It's no use to cry about it, said one of the young women. She's got to go. That's what she said when Esther went away. Esther's husband is here now, almost crazy about her. They took her and sold her away from him. I've been wanting to be free ever since I was a little child. I said to them I didn't believe God ever meant for me to be a slave, even if my skin was black. At any rate, not all my lifetime. Why not have it as in old times, 7 years servants? Master would say, no, you were made to wait on white people. What was niggers made for? Why, just to wait on us all. I am afraid the slaveholders will go to a bad place. I am really afraid they will. I don't think any slaveholder can get to the kingdom of God. Unbelievable person to speak in this quiet way about her children sold away from her. And there are so many others, but part of the point I want to make about these writings, especially the testimonies by black writers, is the response of defenders of slavery. Case after case, there was an attempt to impugn the integrity of the narratives. The accusers would say, oh, well, the slaves are illiterate. They couldn't have written that. Some white abolitionist must have written that for them or edited it or made it up. And over again, there were even committees of inquiry set up. And eventually the abolitionists got clever about this, and they would set up counter committees that would verify the circumstances and the truth of these accounts. But it was remarkable testimony to their power that defenders of the South tried so hard to impugn their honesty. And as we all know, Uncle Tom's Cabin was to a large degree based on the true life story of Josiah Henson, a remarkable slave man whose narrative is also excerpted in this volume. Well, as you go through the book, and I was delighted to hear Crosby say that he's reading it one piece at a time. I encourage you all to follow that same practice. There are surprises in almost every text. How many of us knew that in the 1700s there were several Virginians who were anti-slavery, including slaveholders who were patriots, like Arthur Lee in 1767, Patrick Henry, who wrote a letter to Northern abolitionists in 1773, the famous Patrick Henry, saying that slavery was wrong in every way, unchristian, inhuman, impolitic, and yet it was just too hard to give up the slaves, and he admitted he was a hypocrite because of the convenience of it all. Or George Washington, who, as I mentioned, I think, whose attitudes began to change during the Revolutionary War when he was out of Virginia and seeing a much bigger and more diverse world. There's a letter that Washington wrote to fellow Virginians in 1786, between the end of the war and before, of course, he would take on the presidency, in which he tells a fellow Virginian and slaveholder he wishes to see slavery abolished by the legislature as soon as practicable. Who knew that there was a Virginia Abolition Society in 1791, and that they wrote a petition that was presented to Congress in 1791? The text of that petition is here, as is a similar text the same year from the Maryland Abolition Society, also a slaveholding state. There's a remarkable man called Thomas Brannigan who represents another category of writer. He is his former slave trader himself. Thomas Brannigan was an Irish immigrant to America, came as a young man, but early in his career he worked as first an officer and then a captain of a slave ship, bringing slaves repeatedly. Well, he had a religious epiphany and a conversion experience, and from about 1803 he began to write vehemently against slavery, including a long autobiographical poem called The Penitential Tyrant, published in 1805. He's kind of the American John Newton, the story you all remember from Britain, where John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, had begun life as a slave trader and eventually had a conversion. And when he wrote Amazing Grace, he wrote it not in the voice of a slave. He was actually giving thanks for his own deliverance from the sinfulness of slave trading. Well, Thomas Brannigan, in some ways, makes John Newton look calm. He's so ardent in his writings. And he used to send his books of poems to Thomas Jefferson and ask him to endorse them. And Jefferson, of course, didn't. He would write polite letters back. But it's very interesting that Jefferson kept his volumes, Brannigan's volumes, in his library, which the scholars have recorded today. Anyway, I encourage you to read Brannigan, who is phenomenally guilt-ridden and dramatic in his depiction of the evils of the slave trade. There are a whole host of canonical writers, some of the greatest American writers are in this volume, including Melville and Emerson and Thoreau, and as I mentioned, Louisa May Alcott. But one of the canonical writers who struck me most forcefully was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, because he's famous for such anodyne, patriotic poems, The Song of Hiawatha or Paul Revere's Ride. But let me give you a slightly more, if you will, American Gothic version of Longfellow. He wrote a volume of poems in 1842 called, it was a volume, all of them poems about slavery, called, I want to get the title just right, Poems on Slavery. And one of them was called The Witnesses, and it's a poem about how the Atlantic Ocean, because of the slave trade, is a kind of graveyard from which the bones speak as witnesses. Here's the way the poem goes. In ocean's wide domains, half buried in the sands, lie skeletons in chains with shackled feet and hands. Beyond the fall of dews, deeper than plummet lies, float ships with all their crews, no more to sink nor rise. There the black slave ship swims, freighted with human forms, whose fettered, fleshless limbs are not the sport of storms. These are the bones of slaves. They gleam from the abyss. They cry from yawning waves, we are the witnesses. The poem goes on in that vein with the refrain, we are the witnesses. Even Emily Dickinson, who was famous for not commenting on political matters, even on the Civil War while it was raging all around her, has a poem in this volume called Color, Caste, Denomination, where she imagines that God, of course, didn't mean for any divisions of human beings according to color, caste, or denomination. But at the other end of the spectrum, from the famous canonical writers, there are utterly unknown people. And one of my favorite writers is still unknown. He's anonymous, although he used the initials TT. And I want to tell you about two of his stories published in 1831. Very boring titles, A Dream and Another Dream. Well, it turns out these are kind of interesting dreams. The second of them is a dream in which the protagonist wakes up in a kind of a race war, where the race war has broken out between blacks and whites. Blacks have won. The last white captives are being rounded up, and the black Congress is debating what to do with them, whether to kill them or enslave them or send them back to Europe. And then, of course, the speaker wakes up. His other dream offers America a different future. Remember, this is 1831. These two stories are printed 30 years before the Civil War comes, and here's how visionary they are. In the other dream, the protagonist wakes up, slavery has ended, integration has occurred, there's racial harmony and equality, and he's in a drawing room talking with a mixed-race crowd of people like we have here tonight, and into the room walks the first black president of the United States. 177 years before Barack Obama was inaugurated, this writer had a vision of a time when America would have a black president. You see why I like this literature. I mean, it unleashes all kinds of forces and possibilities. But there's a closing sequence in the volume, and I want to say a word about it because it touches on a very popular film that's been around this year, Spielberg's Lincoln, which I'm sure most of you or all of you have seen. Near the close of the book, of course, the 13th Amendment, January 13, 1865, a very matter-of-fact text. And a little bit further on, almost at the end, is Lincoln's famous second inaugural address, March 4th, 1865, that they come just weeks apart. But in between is a text that somehow Mr. Spielberg didn't know about, which I think is enormously significant. On February 12th, 1865, just 12 days after the 13th Amendment was passed, and you remember those scenes in the film Lincoln, all of them in Congress, with those fierce debates and votes and so on, into that room stepped Henry Highland Garnett, and he delivered a sermon to Congress. It was the first time a black man had addressed the U.S. Congress. So it's a monumental occasion. It occurs just 12 days after this 13th Amendment is passed. And here's just one paragraph or two from Henry Highland Garnett's addressed to Congress that day. He said, "Great sacrifices have been made by the people, yet greater still are demanded ere atonement can be made for our national sins." Doesn't this sound like Lincoln when talking about every drop of blood shed by the last shall be matched by one from the sword? Eternal justice holds heavy mortgages against us and will require the payment of the last farthing. We have involved ourselves in the sin of unrighteous gain, stimulated by luxury and pride and the love of power and oppression, and prosperity and peace can be purchased only by blood and with tears of repentance. We have paid some of the fearful installments, but there are other heavy obligations to be met. Henry Highland Garnett in 1865. Well, you see why each of these texts has a significance. It helps to flesh out a larger story. I've tried to write to Ed Zwick, the man who made the film Glory, and suggest that each of these should be made into a film in a certain way. But I want to leave you with just two closing thoughts, and then I'm happy if we have time for quite Q&A and some discussion to hear your reactions. My first of the closing thoughts is that this volume for me, who began life as an English professor, is a testimony about why literature matters. Ultimately, I hope it's an inspiration in some ways for English majors and humanists and creative writers and people who run libraries, because this is how I believe human awareness and human values and human sensibilities are shaped, not by the passage of laws, not by legislators enacting public dicta, but through imagination and empathy, through emulation, through ideas and idealism. Spielberg could not show this century and a half progression in his film, but it was the essential, necessary precondition for those political acts which he depicts in that film. As Percy Bysshe Shelley said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And the other thing I want to close with is that pulling all these texts together, I think, accomplishes something important for all of us as Americans, and I'm very, very pleased and proud that Library of America decided to publish this volume, because it established this body of writing, not as a body of black writing or this or that school of white writing, but as a body of American writing. And of course, slavery is a subject that has always involved both black and white Americans to their enormous detriment from the beginning. So I'm very, very pleased that the Library of America has essentially affirmed this body of writing as an essential part of the American canon. And the last thing I want to say is that maybe some of you are teachers. I'd love to meet you. I know there's at least one great teacher here, history teacher of the year from past years, but any of you who are in touch with schools or teachers, it's my deep hope that this book will find its way into classrooms and be used, one text or reading or poem at a time, to help restore to our collective consciousness and in the next generation these essential texts from our own cultural memory. Thank you very much.